the papers, you can see labour regimes in the title. So there's an element of labour regime conceptual discussion in the paper. I try and weave in notions of labour citizenship or worker citizenship into that. And then this notion of management conceptions or kind of management discourse or narrative, which I guess is the main, what I'm trying to make the main thesis of the paper. And, just first of all, on the concept of labour regimes, the very idea of using the phrase regime kind of naturally raises questions of power and domination and inequality and hegemony and so on. And there is, the idea, as has been discussed previously today, particularly in our keynote lecture, the idea of the workplace regime or the labour regime is been reinvigorated in recent years. I mean, you go back to the kind of classical work of Burraway and so on, but in the last 5 or 10 years, it's got renewed attention, renewed discussion. But there is, with any kind of reinvigoration, there's a lot of debate about exactly what a labour regime is. And there's not agreement, I don't think, and it gets used in quite different ways. So that's important. And, warehousing is a good example of those discussions and those debates about labour regimes, because I think there is a tendency to assume that warehouses globally tend towards despotic, what Burraway called despotic labour regimes based upon low wages, high labour turnover, management hostility to unions and collective bargaining, precarious work and so on. And, and I think there is, and that's interesting because a lot of that comes because of the focus on Amazon. A lot of it comes out of North America. And it's interesting, again, in light of what Valeria said about some of the more recent research, particularly in Europe, which is challenging those conceptions, which is at least saying there's perhaps more variety in terms of labour regimes than we might have previously understood. So I think that's important in this context. And I guess my paper here is trying to, in terms of the debate about labour regime, which is ongoing, is trying to make a specific argument about one aspect of that debate, which is around the role of narrative, and essentially to say that more research needs to be done on the role of narrative and discourse, which help to serve as the kind of socio-cultural glue, as it's put in the paper, for labour regimes. They're part of the assemblage. And in the paper, I try and frame that via Gramsci and the idea of obviously hegemony, but ideas of normative grammars in kind of framing that. And in terms of the specifics of my argument, I guess I'm trying to say that in this case, the narrative of employers should be taken more seriously, that there is a tendency in some of the research on warehousing and logistics to kind of treat employer discourse with great suspicion, to kind of see it as duplicitous and self-serving and sort of cynical. That in other words, that employers will sort of just say anything to cover the fact that at the end of the day, all they want to do is exploit a kind of circulating a regime of cheap labour, especially migrant labour. And certainly that is true. That level of exploitation is there. I'm not denying that, but I also think that there's more to the rhetoric of employers, and that it's worthy of a closer attention, because employer rhetoric is not just about it's not necessarily so cynical. It can be actually about responding to real kind of ontological changes in markets and technologies and organisations. So that's, I guess, what I'm trying to make the main argument of the paper. Now, and in doing that, I try and bring in notions of worker citizenship, and without going into that in detail, because there's no time. I kind of end with this. I come to this concept of the conscientious worker, the conscientious or diligent worker citizen, as one who is able to maintain high standards of accuracy in workplaces where automated processes are highly dependent upon data inputs. And the research question which guides the paper is, and quoting from the paper, is: do employers envisage an ideal worker citizen in warehouse logistics? If so, who is it? what are their social characteristics and how has this image changed over time. The paper deploys two methods broadly. One is kind of just descriptive analysis of ABS data, and then the other is kind of thematic analysis of data from interviews with employers earlier this year. And I interviewed 17 employers or employer representatives from different companies, like there's food and grocery distribution, textiles, clothing and footwear. There were some industry consultants and others, which is all listed in the methodology section of my paper. So first of all, with the first kind of method there, about the descriptive analysis, I talk about how warehousing has been very fast growing in Australia, how since from the mid-1980s until now, warehousing employment has grown like 6.5 times faster on average than national employment. I also talk about an increase in the occupational role for store persons, or picker packers, as they're often known in the industry. So perhaps if you want to give me the next slide, Michael, thank you, just this one. So this is just some analysis of change in terms of occupations, and you can see there the black line there is store persons, a significant increase of basically a doubling, or more than doubling in the number of store persons over that same period from the mid-80s to 2023. And you know, a growth relative to other occupations within logistics broadly defined. And then also the paper talks about a dramatic increase in the number of women working in warehousing, including as store persons. And if I could get the next slide, please. And this is the last slide I've got. So this looks at the increase in women employed as store persons. So today we have, according to ABS data, so let's say 100,000 people approximately working in warehousing, and about a quarter or close to a quarter of those are women. So a very significant increase over time. From the 80s until now, the female warehousing workforce increased by over 21 times. So there is a tendency to employ more women. I also talk about the changes in the kind of migrant composition of the workforce as well in that part of the paper. So anyway, then to the kind of the final, or I guess the main part, empirical contribution of the paper around the employer conceptions of the ideal warehouse worker, based on the kind of thematic analysis of what employers said in interviews. I kind of divide this into 4 sections. First of all, on rising e-commerce demand and Amazon's arrival in Australia, and then on investment in new automation projects, the changing face of the workforce in kind of racial and gender terms, and then this idea of the conscientious worker. And in terms of just very quickly, in terms of Amazon, the rising e-commerce, particularly during COVID, and the role of Amazon. I mean, Amazon is a relatively late arrival in Australia. It's only been here for the last 5 or 6 years, much more recent arrival than in Europe or in Germany or in the UK, you know, not to mention North America, obviously. And but in that time, it's had quite a significant effect, and the paper documents some of that. And one of those effects is this intersection with the availability of new automated technologies. And that's discussed in the paper as well. And that the paper partly discusses that in terms of spatial dimensions. So an increase in the kind of 3-dimensional space of warehousing. So where you can't kind of increase the warehouse floor, you go up. And there's a tendency to increase the height of warehouse spaces, and part of this is because of a shortage of supply and the very high cost of commercial land, or just land in general around Australia's metropolitan cities. But a lot of the automation allows that to occur by increasing the height of warehouses, or even a tendency towards more recently multi-story warehouses, which is on the increase as well. I think Amazon's most recent fulfillment center in Melbourne is I think I'm correct in saying it's multi-story. And then I also talk about this in terms of displacement effects for labour, and employers have something to say about job losses. And, you know, just to kind of summarise that view, there's a tendency to see this as productivity enhancing rather than labour displacing. So one quote from a warehouse manager: because of the automation project, we doubled our capacity without having to increase our workforce. So that's how they frame it. But then what I really try and focus on in the paper are the limits to automation, something which has been noted in research overseas as well. the limits to automation driven by, I guess, the very high expense of the automation projects, and also the risk involved, particularly for smaller firms, for third-party logistics, for some third-party logistics suppliers, for firms that are locked in kind of supply chain contracts with larger firms. Yeah, and that meaning that often firms are reluctant to kind of fully automate or fully invest in an automated storage and retrieval system. And there's a tendency to bring in kind of hybrid systems, kind of hybridizing manual, semi-automated and automated within a single warehouse space, and often doing that spatially by kind of dividing the warehouse into zones, and often by combining more than one labour process within a single warehouse roof. And some of this is because of what's called omni-channel demands, like firms that are within a single warehouse, they're supplying for business to consumer, so they're supplying for e-commerce and online shopping, but they're also still supplying for big box retail and to physical storefronts at the same time. So they have to accommodate demand from both, and there's a great deal of uncertainty about the kind of optimal balance between those two elements of their business. They don't know what's going to happen. So it's in this context that employers talked about changes in workforce composition, including the increased employment of women. And sometimes that was framed in terms of kind of changes in the erstwhile physically laborious nature of the labour process in warehousing. But more generally, employers emphasised behavioural and cognitive traits rather than physical traits. And into this, we get this idea of the conscientious worker. So, I mean, employers said a lot about what these kind of behavioural traits might be about the ideal worker. But the phrases which were used more often than most were phrases like the need for conscientiousness, or synonymous descriptors like diligence, attention to detail, eye for detail, care, discipline, self-discipline, meticulousness, and especially accuracy. This kind of partly coincides with the shift to what's called batch picking within warehousing, which is something which I define and talk about in the paper. Just one quote which kind of sums up this view from an industry consultant. He said that these environments will only work with highly accurate inputs, and to have highly accurate inputs requires high levels of discipline. The ability for a person to do a task exactly the same way every single time is crucial. And in the same consultant talks about this in terms of people's personal habits. So, quote, we need people who have everything labelled and facing the right direction in the pantry in their house, rather than somebody else's house where what should be in the pantry is in 7 locations and 75% is open on the bench. They're the sort of things that make the difference. We want the person who's got their pantry set up with all the labels lined up and pointing in the right direction. And then, you know, this in the paper, I sort of argue that this narrative is quite gendered and racialized, and there's some choice quotes in there, you know, quite, let's say, highly stereotyped quotes about the racial and gender characteristics of workers, which I won't quote to you, but you can go and read the paper and see for yourself what is argued there. So that's what the paper is about. You know, I'm arguing that undoubtedly, you know, some of this involves a kind of crude stereotyping of worker attributes and worse than that. But, you know, my argument is that the reiteration of these characteristics of meticulousness and conscientiousness, they're not just cynical, they're contextualized directly by transformations in labour processes driven by changes to markets, supply chains and technologies. And, you know, the evidence from my interview suggests that these kind of combinatory or hybrid approaches are the norm, in which managers are kind of utilising warehouse space to combine more than one labour process. And whichever one they emphasise, you know, in either case, the emphasis is on having workers who can avoid mistakes by following machine-generated instructions to the letter. So in that context, accuracy was emphasised by employers as equally as speed and volume in warehouse fulfilment. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.